Hi guys, so the very first project in JS. I hope it's going to be an interesting one. Definitely loads of new things to learn, and you'll get to know like the core methods in JS. Without those methods, you kind of cannot become a web developer. So I think after today, you'll feel like the ocean of possibilities is opening up to you, and you're gonna feel like all this knowledge you can just finally put into like use in practice and like in the real life scenario. So let's see what we are looking at today. So got this huge create an element button on the screen in the middle, and every time you click the button, a new box is showing, a square box, simple black square box with a number in it. Every fifth element, however, is slightly different. So it's square and white, so 5, 10, 15th, and so on is different. These are actual divs, new divs showing onto our page. And this is our task for today. So my advice to you is that before you sit down to any project, you should think of a target of the final outcome, and depending on how advanced the project is or how advanced you are, either on the paper or in your head, but think of the steps to achieving your goal. So I've prepared the steps for us for today, and so have a look at those. We've got part 1, create an index HTML file and document structure. So I have already created mine. You can simply either press on here, new file, or new file, right hand click, or on the top you've got exactly the same thing, file and new file. Remember to add the HTML extension. And for the document structure, if you are using, as advised, the Visual Studio Code, you already have an emmet built in, and so it's enough to just press an exclamation mark and enter, and the skeleton is ready for us. There you go. Then create a button in HTML. Call point 3. Style the button and the squares which will be created. So that button here is going to be created in HTML, and even though those will be created by JS, the visual layer is going to be created by the CSS. Cool, and this is it for the HTML and CSS, and all the rest is all JS. It's all in JS. So go set up a click event listener on the button element. We'll have to set up a listener for every time we click on the button. So whenever we click on the button, something should happen. But first things first, there are loads of different events we can listen for, and we can listen on any element. So for instance, if there was a scroll on the window, on that entire element in DOM window, we could set up an event for to listen for a scroll event on a window. And we will actually do it in another exercise. So it's going to become a little more clear. But for now, we're going to listen for a click event on our button element. Once we set up a listener, we will declare a function. A function needs to do something, because just by the fact that it exists, it doesn't do much. So in the function, we will make sure it creates the HTML element. So the divs. The function will be responsible for creating those divs, but this is not enough, because creating those and putting them in the void somewhere in the program is not enough for us. We need the function to add the actual divs to the page, as it happens here. So it becomes the element of the DOM, document object model. Next, create a counter and complete the contents of the div element with the value of the counter. Meaning, whenever we create an element, it has a number. So we know how many elements we have on the page. So it means there is a sort of a counter that will do the math for us, because we do not actually manually put the number inside every box. So the counter will be responsible for calculating what is the number needed and putting it in the box, inside the box. Last but not least, number 6, with the help of an if statement, mark every 5th element and give it a different class. So the fact that this is different and the element number 10 is going to be different, and 15, we do it by the use of classes. So we create a different class, and that class is going to have different styles, and this is going to be dealt with by number 3. However, deciding which of the elements is the 5th one and so on is gonna be a part of our function. That's it. So once you've created the HTML document, you can start the live server by right-hand click and open with live server. Then F12, or also like right-hand click and inspect. You're gonna open DevTools. I prefer, if my DevTools, for actually just for the need of the course, prefer them to be on the bottom. Normally I keep them on the right hand side, but this is like a very personal and individual preference, so do as you feel is more comfortable for you. Got those elements, console, sources, network. For now, I think console is going to be the most needed. Right, so far we dealt with number 1. Let's move on to number 2. Create a button in HTML. To create a button in HTML, we open a tag, we put an selector button. It's already self-closing. The Visual Studio Code is doing the work for us. I'm going to create it. I'm going to name it create an element, as in the example. Go create an element, save it. And it's showing on the screen. Great. Cool. So 2 points already checked off the list. Number 3, style the button and the squares which will be created. So, as I said, the squares will be created by the JavaScript function that we're gonna write ourselves. But before that happens, let's put manually few divs. You can do it by if you're a Mac user, Option, Shift, and then arrow down, and it's going to copy paste the same thing over and over again. If you're not a Mac user, instead of an option, use Alt. So Shift, Alt, and the arrow down. So I've created those few divs, and they already exist, but they have like a 0 pixels height, so they are invisible. So let's change that. Normally we would write styles in a different file, that for today, it's okay for us to put a style inside the head element. So style, great. And inside that style, we're gonna put our styles. So button. By default, button is an inline element. So to be able to change its position, we're gonna change display to block. Once it's block element, we can decide on its margins. So let's change 25 pixels and to auto. So 25 pixels from top and bottom, and auto on the left and right. So it's going to place it right in the middle of our page. Save it, and as you can see, it's nicely moved to the middle of the page on the very top. Next thing, style the button and the squares. So we now gonna style squares, which are divs. So like div selector, and we want them to be square. So 30 pixels, whoops, height 30 pixels. Height. Whoops. 30 pixels height, and the same for the width, as is per usual for the square elements. Okay. Now to make them kind of visible for us, so we know what we're working with, the background color, and let's set it to black. Obviously, if you just like black, you prefer them to be pink, use your own imagination and go for it. I don't mind at all. So, got black. Let's save it. And they already exist. They are visible. These are block elements, so they show up one underneath the other. And because there are no margins, they look like one big blob. So let's change that. Let's give them margin 5 pixels. Now they're separate, and also let's float them to the left so they're actually nicely next to each other. Bang! Works. Then let's give them some numbers so we can see what the number inside is going to look like. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, save it. Oh, you can't see it because the font by default is going to be black, so let's change the color of the font to white. And to make it nicely in the middle, is just for the aesthetic purposes, to make it neat and tidy. Line text align, put it to center, and actually to put into the middle we need to use the line height and set it to the same pixels as the height of the element, so 30 pixels. Save it, and I think that's kind of what we were looking at before. Good. Now, as you can see, they are all the same, and we wanted every fifth element to be different, to be a circle. And for that purpose, we will create a class called circle. And now, whoops. Now we're gonna create a class. So a dot circle, opening curly bracket. And what do we need to change? We want our circles to be white. So let's set background color to white. Now it disappeared because it doesn't have a border. So let's set border to 2 pixels, solid black. Save it. What are we missing? We want them to be circles, so radius or the radius set to 50%. Nice. And now let's change the font color to the default black. It is pretty much what we wanted, and I'm very happy with it. And so the number 3 style, the button and the squares and the circle which will be created is kind of dealt with, and I think we can move on to JS. Because I've manually put those divs inside and we don't want that. I'm gonna remove them. So now they are gone. And what are we supposed to do next? Set up a click event listener on the button element. We have that create an element button on our page. And to perform any action on the element, we need to make sure that it is actually stored somewhere. So we need to store it in a variable. Before we actually going to put any code relating to JS, we need to make sure that we have a suitable place to put our code to. So again, a normally similar situation to the CSS file, we'll put in a separate file that we could name app.js, but we could also, and today, that's the way we're going to do it, so that you guys can just focus on the actual JS script. Got script tag, and inside the script tag, we're going to put all our code. If we wanted to put it in a separate file, we would create a file. We would name it app.js, like for instance app.js, and then we'll put all our code in there. But today, as I said, we don't do it. And then we just put script, and inside the script we'll put source and app.js. We will do it the next time, so don't worry. Everything ahead of us. But today script inside here. And so, okay, so we are coming back to number 3, actually number 1 of JavaScript. Set up a click event listener on the button element. To set up a click event on the button element, we need to grab the button element and store it in a variable. For that element, we're going to use a const, so the constant variable that is not going to change, because we're going to call btn and going to use document query selector. Query selector, a few words about that. So the name is pretty much self-explanatory. So we are querying for a selector. Selector is none other thing but, like for instance, the button here or the div in here or a circle class. So we use single or double quotation marks, and inside there we put the element or the selector we are interested in. So bear in mind this is going to take a form of a string, and bear in mind the main difference between this selector and the CSS selector is that if we put another button on here, create a blah blah, right? So we can see straight away, we can see another button on our page, and it's styled exactly the same way as our button selector would suggest in styles. However, if we put a button on here in our document query selector, only the first element is going to be grabbed and stored in that variable. So it cannot contain more than one element. It's just going to be the first button. It works apart from that, it works the same way. So if, for instance, we had a class circle on here, we could put that on here, for instance, this way, button circle, or just like that, class circle, and it would be still the same element. You can see that in here, I put btn and see what's going to print out, and it's going to be this element that it's finding on the page. So the first button element, or the first actually looking for a class circle, and it's showing that if we put body element, save it, btn, it's finding body element. So whatever we're going to put in the query selector, this is the element from our document object model that is going to find and stored in that variable. If we put p, and so far we have no p in our HTML, what do you think should happen? Save it. Let's remove that class circle so that our button is as we wanted it to be before. Save it. Yeah. We're looking for a p element that we are storing now in the btn. btn. So it's not going to throw, actually I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So it's finding no p in our document. It's not throwing an error. It's just assigning it to null. So not finding it, but deciding it's going to be a null. No problem here from the console. Let's come back to the button. So we've got a button. Our btn, as you can see now, is, as we intended from the very beginning, just a button. So now, once we store the button element in the const btn, we can perform the action. The action we want to perform is to set up a click event listener. So this is going to be like a monumental moment, because it's one of the most important methods in JS. A new way to becoming a web developer. This is like one single most important moment. So btn dot, because we want to do something on the button, add event listener and open braces. So it can take 2 to 3 arguments, and we're going to focus on those 2 arguments first. So the first argument is the event we are listening for. Every one method of add event listener can only listen for one event. You can add many of those, but in a separate method. So in one, we can only include one method. Single, double quote, I'm going to put single ones, and click. If you put click, it's already a built-in method. You don't need to define it anywhere. It already exists and you can just use it. It's given to us from JS. The second argument on here is what is supposed to be performed when we hear the click. So the listener is listening for an event, the event being a click, and second thing is what should happen when the click happens. And here we put a function. So for now, I'm going to put a anonymous function for the clarity, break the line here, and just see if it works. Console log, click. So now, for every time I click a create an element button, it should print out a text. Click into the console. Click, 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 click. So it works. It doesn't print click one underneath the other because it's exactly the same thing. So the console is actually saving space. And you can see that the new number is added. So every time I click the element, some things happen. One thing happens, the one thing that we wanted, and we specify and we instructed the program to do for us. So now we have that click. This is an anonymous function. We could also do it. I'm going to copy my anonymous function. I'm going to cat it. And I'm going to put named function. Add element in here. I add a semicolon at the end to make it neat and tidy. And we could also do it this way. Normally, any event listener should go at the very end because we want this action to be performed once everything else is already kind of like decided upon. So that conf button is storing button and everything is like defined. Once everything is defined, we could put the add event listener at the end. So it makes sense. So it works in a logical way. So to use a named function, I'm going to create a const. And I'm going to name it add element equals. And I'm going to paste my anonymous function here. So now from the anonymous function, I transformed it into a named function, and this function is defined here. And this is just a reference. So whenever I should click on the element, the same thing should happen. So let's save it, let's refresh, and let's see if that is what happens. So the same thing happens. The outcome is exactly the same, and it makes sense because, you know, like if you only want to do a perform certain thing once, and it's not a reusable piece of code, then it's okay to put as an anonymous function. But if you think you're going to use add element a lot, it makes better sense to separate it and refactor it and to separate into a separate piece of code that you could be able to use over and over again in some other places. If I make a mistake and I put something else in here, it's going to throw an error. Uncode reference error, add element is not defined. Where is it not defined? Line 54. Line 54, we go to line 54, which is here, and it says, the program says that the add element is not defined because this is our function and it's called add elementa. Add elementa is not add element. So the program is not going to get for you, oh, you meant this. No, it's going to throw an error. So only exact names. Also bear in mind that if you put brackets here, so it's like calling a method right away, you're going to call that method right away. So once the interpreter goes from top to the bottom of that program, it's going to call a function straight away. So if I save it, you can see that the click is already visible on here. So before, I can't do anything, it's just, it doesn't work. So I'm going to refresh again just for you to see. Click is right there from the beginning. We don't want to call a function, we want to put a reference to the function. So this and here is just a reference to that function here. And we specify what should happen on here once click occurs. But we don't want to call that add element function straight away. So be careful with that. This is just a reference to the actual function. Cool. We have that. Let's see what is the next thing on the list. We set up a click event listener on the button element. Done. Declare the function. Add element function declared. Done. Point 3. In the function, create HTML element. Cool. So, the next method for us, let's comment this out because we don't need it for just now. We want to create an element. How do we do it? So, just as a curiosity, I'm going to show you that if you put a document and then you put body, so document.body, and try printing out, it's going to find the body element. If you do document and document element, it's going to find the entire HTML document. You can find anything you want here. So if you want to perform anything on body or document elements of the HTML, you can actually use that shortcut, document.body. So it's not necessary for you to be using query selector where you create a const body and then only then store the body element into that const, but you can kind of refer to it or get inside it straight away. However, you cannot do, for instance, if you wanted to document body and then make a reference to the button on the page, that's too much. That will be asking too much of the program. It doesn't work this way, so you would get undefined. But the other two shortcuts are okay. So for instance, to create an element inside our function as responsible for everything that is happening today, we put document, and that's the method create element. Create element, and again, open up bracket, and inside here we specify what element we want to create, and we want to create a div. Creating a thing, and it's like querying for a button but without assigning it to somewhere specific. So it's best if we actually store it somewhere. We could name it an element or a box or a square and sometimes a circle. But for instance, I think it's because we create an element that is an actual div, we can name it div, and it makes sense for the semantic purposes, so you know that you will be storing some divs in here. So you create a const div, and then that method document has loads of different methods, and you will look into it and go create element, and now you specify what element you want to create. So we created a element. Let's refresh the page. Let's save it. Let's refresh. And now I'm gonna console log. Actually, I'm gonna use this console log from here. Copy that, cut out, and print underneath and comment. And inside that console log, I'm gonna console log a div. Save it. Now, if I press on the create an element, you can see on the in the console that it's printing out the div element. So whatever I specify within here inside, again, as a string, you specify what HTML element you would like to create. So you can create, for instance, h1. And again, anytime I'm going to press on the create element, it's going to create, as you can see, h1. You could go and create h12. And it's going to accept it. The program is going to accept that you want to create h12 element, but from the semantic point of view, it doesn't make any sense because there is no h12. So I strongly recommend to only creating elements which actually exist in the documentation. So we want to create a div. And we don't only want to create a div, we want to add a div to the page. Because you see, the function happens, but then the program is not that clever for it to guess what we wanted to achieve. We need to specify every single step. So if we created the element, now we need to specify what we want to do with the element. Do we want to add it somewhere? And if we do want to add it somewhere, where is the place we want to add it? And etc, etc. So we want to add our element to the document body. Document body, append child, and we say what we want to append. So this is the next method that you're gonna kind of see a lot. So that you created an element, and now this element is a child element, and so you want to append the child element to somewhere in the body. And if we do it on the body, it's always going to go at the very end. If we wanted to append another point onto the list, it would always go to the bottom. So it's always at the end. Append the child, and within the brackets, we specify what we want to append. So in that case, we want to append that const div. Finish off nicely with the semicolon, and there we go. Got a document body, append child, and now it should nicely add the div element to our document. And save it to refresh. See if happens. Yay, it works. So we've got this. We create an element and we are adding it. It's plain black, no counter, no number, but some things are already happening, and I think it's kind of like a breakthrough moment, because you can see that how you can play with things and how a few lines of code can create things, the virtual things that do not exist apart from in the internet or in our program. Cool. So we've got that. And what's next? Declare the function. In the function, create HTML elements. We did that. Add the div to the page. We are adding loads of divs to the page. And now create a counter and complete the contents of the div element with the value of the counter. So that's the thing we wanted to achieve. We wanted the boxes to say how many of them are there, or have the actual ID number. So we go back to our function. And we should think about what we want to do for our function to be that clever and to be able to, to tell us how to insert those numbers. Before we do that, in the console, we have a property that is called a text content. So I'm going to show you an example of the button. So we have that const button that is storing our button. And if I put button btn dot and then put text content, enter, it's going to print out in the console what is the caption in the button. So I put the text of create an element, and so it returns a string of create an element. If, however, I wanted to change the text content, I would put blob, 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 anything I wanted to say, and now my button is changing the text to a blah, blah, blah. And that's how we can play with the text inside. So that's exactly what we're going to do. This is not a method, it's a property. So that's the difference. So you can, like, by the assigning mark here, change the property of that text content. Let's refresh. And so how should we approach this problem of a character? If I put, let's say we have the create element div, we append child, and now I wanted to say that inside here I'm going to create a const, I'm going to call it a number, and I'll give it a value of 1. So now let's say this is my const number 1, and I want to, for my div element, to have a property of a text content, and I want to give it a value of 1. Save it. Create an element. Okay, so something has happened. I now have a text inside my box, and that is great because it's a progress. But we don't want one to be inside every single one of them. So we don't want it to be hard coded. So I'm going to use that const that I've created before, and I will give it a number on here. So technically it should do the same, exactly the same thing, because number has assigned number 1. I've got create an element, and again it's printing 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So good, great, that's what we wanted. But now we want to increment the number. We want with every new box to increment the number by 1. So let's say at the end here, I'm going to say number equals, so exactly what it was before. For instance, now it's 1, 1, and I want to make a number plus 1. So it's 1 plus 1, and it should become 2. Should it? Create an element, uncaught type error. So we have an error assignment to a constant variable as kind of not non-possible. Why is that? Because const is something that we cannot reassign a new value. So once we have a const, that's it. It's going to be a number 1, and we cannot change it later on here. We have to change that const into a let. That's an easy fix for now. Create. Let's see what happens. Go create an element. Damn, it's still printing at 1. We kind of like got rid of one problem because it's no longer throwing an error. So we did interfere, or we did change the number, but one thing, it doesn't show in here. So Not great, is it? Let's do console log and let's see what that number here is showing. Save it and create an element. So as you can see, I press create an element button and it's printing out 1, but in the console it's returning 2 because this console log is giving me the updated number of a number. So it's at the end of this function here, it is actually 2. Why do you think this happens? It's because this function, whatever happens within this function, so within those curly braces, happens once, and then when a new click occurs, this happens all over again. So this function's life begins and ends, and this number and this div is always a new number and a new div. Its life is determined by the duration of the function. So as long as this function lasts, this is the number and that's the div that we talk about. But every new element is like when the function started and it finished, and now again this is a new start of a function and again it's finished. And so by the end of this function here, we wanted to give it a new number and we did. But when we click again, a number no longer exists in the memory of the program because it's in this scope here. So it finished its life. It's no more. Is no longer in the memory of the program. So what we need to do here is take it out and place it in the outer scope. So we declare our variable let number outside the function, so it lives on. Let's save it, let's refresh, and let's see how it works now. So we've got create an element, and it increments the number inside the box and in the console. Why is that? It's because the function starts in here, creates that element, adding the element onto the page in our document object model. A new div is added. Then that div gets a property of a number, and that property of a number is taken from here. Why is that? It's because why this function, even though it executes the code within the curly braces, can find the value of a number from here? It's because of something like looking for a value in the outer scope. So for instance, if we had that number specified on here, let a number, and it called inside the function, every time we create an element, that number, or we wanted to reassign a value, would take a number from here and would find this string inside, and this inside would be printed out to the console as well, but inside the boxes. So the inside is not managing to stay inside, but if you click on here, it's inside the E, so the E also exists. And in the console log, it's printing out as well the number with the one added to it. But if that doesn't exist inside the function, it will look for a variable with the name of a number outside, and then it's going to take the value from here. So number at first equals 1, and it's going to print out 1. At the end of the function, we are altering the value of number, adding 1 to it. So whatever was the number at the beginning 1, we are adding 1, and the number is reassigned a new value. So it's no longer 1, it's now 2. Then we create another element, and by the end the number is 2 and we're adding 1, and so on and so on. So that's why now it's taking the right number. Putting it this way is actually like not very common. More often than this, you would put number plus plus, and it would do exactly the same thing. And it's called an incrementation. You could use a decrementation, and it would go -1 every time. Create an element and it will go backwards. Cool. So this is it. And last bit of our project is number 6. With the help of an if statement, mark every 5th element and give it a different class. So let's see you in just a second. Hi, so we have only one last thing to do to finish our project, and it's point number 6. With the help of an if statement, mark every 5th element and give it a different class. So a fun part for now. And so what do we want to achieve is that every time we click on the create element button, that 5th element, so 5, 10, 15, 20, is different. It takes a class of a circle that we specified here. So it's round, white, with the black font. Right. Let's open the console, so F12 or a right-hand click and inspect. And before we get started, let's just very quickly summarize what we have done so far. So far, we created a button element in the HTML, so it's here, and obviously the visual layer of it, so the CSS styles here, but we're not going to focus on them right now. And let's talk about JS. What we wanted to do is to set up a click event listener on the button element. To work on any element using JS, we need to make sure that it is stored. So we grabbed an element from the document object model, and we created a constant variable to have it stored somewhere. So we've got that const btns because it's not going to be altered anywhere else, anywhere later on. So we could easily and freely assign it to a const, and the equation mark, so whatever is on the right hand side is assigned to that const button. And to do that, we use a query selector method, which is searching through our HTML document and is searching using a selector. In that case, we were searching for a button. Show you something else. We could also use a different method, and it's a get element by ID. So for instance, if that button had ID and it had an ID of a active, or just a first button, then we could do that on here and use a first button instead. We could also do that using our query selector, and instead of using no indication of what we're looking at, and use the hash. So this is exactly the same thing, but using the hash. Ta-da. But anyway, we are not looking for an ID. We are looking for a button that is just a single one on our website. So we don't need to use either ID or a class or anything else because we only have a one single button on our website. Once we grab that element and store it somewhere, then we could perform something on it. So we wanted to like attach an event listener to our button. That is happening right here at this very end, which makes sense because everything else needs to be, the logic of the programmer needs to be or should be defined before we do anything else. So is at the very end, we've got that button. We get an inside, so we can perform anything by like stating what is the element we want to perform our action on, and then dot. And after a dot, we can specify what we want to do. And we wanted to add an event listener. Event listener in this case takes two arguments, in the first one being what we are listening for, which is a click, and the second argument is what should happen when the event happens. So it should be a function. Instead of a click, it could be for instance, a mouse move. And so that every time we move our mouse over a create element button, a new element is added to the site. You can see. So it could be, it's like loads of different events that we can listen for. It doesn't need to be a click, but in this project we work on a click. Let's save it. And the other argument is a function. The function is what should be performed when the click occurs. So add the element. In our case, we didn't use an anonymous function, and we kind of extracted it, and we created a named function. So we created a const named add element and assigned it, and assigned the anonymous function to it. So inside our add event listener method is just a reference to it. And it makes sense if we want to use it in any other part of code. So for instance, I'm going to present it to you in a console. So if I wanted to use it somewhere else, and the brackets are for like executing methods. So I'm calling my method add element, and the new element shows up on the screen. And if you press an arrow up, it's just like calling the last line of code from the console. Enter, and you can see that another box is showing up on the screen. Every time, press an arrow up instead of typing another add element, and the code is executed. So it wouldn't be possible if we only declared an anonymous function, and because you can only call methods, you can only execute functions. So if I wanted to, like for instance, execute just a button is not a method, so I've got an error. So it's just like a bits and pieces of information for you to like kind of get used to it. So if this was a declared anonymous function, we wouldn't be able to get inside it. We wouldn't be able to call it. It would be only possible for us to like execute a function once the click event happens. So it makes sense to kind of like refactor your code and have it separate. So let's analyze our function. what did we do? We create a function and assign it to a variable so that we can refer to it from other places in the program. It's exactly what I said. And our function was supposed to create new divs and add them to the page. So we use the document.createElement method, which as an argument specifies what kind of HTML element we want to add to our document object model. This function does not interfere with an actual source code. So we have our HTML file in the computer, and so just bear in mind that it doesn't actually add anything to it. It just kind of like manipulates the DOM elements on the web page. So only things they are showing onto the screen, but the new pieces of code will not be introduced in the HTML. Okay, so we use that document. Document is the document, let's say the HTML element, and it has different methods. Like you can think of it like different drawers that you can open and see what's inside. So this one is create an element, and here we specify what element we want to create. But before the program doesn't actually decide on its own what to do with it. So for that matter, we need to use, for that purpose, we need to add a div to the page ourselves, giving it another instruction. So we use this abbreviation here, a document body, that is rather than assigning a document body into the const to another variable, we can just use this abbreviation here and use its method append child. Then child will then add whatever we say to the specified element. So that's the element we were working on. And at the end of whatever we put in here, if we put something else, like we have a list and we want to add another point to the list, then we would work on that list in here, then use that same method of append child, which would add another element to it. Instead of that div here, we could probably just copy and paste that in here, and the result would be exactly the same. Instead of assigning it first to that const div, we would just append child, and this would be executed so that the program would know that, oh, we want to create an element that is a div. But for the clarity of the code, I think it's always best to just like put it in separate lines, and it's like simple, nice, tidy, and looking at the code, you know what's happening there. So let's stick to the div. We wanted to have a counter inside, so we created the let number outside our function so that it's like it can be reassigned, or it can be given a new value, so that every time function happens is executed, we are incrementing the number, which is stored in our variable let number here. So once it's run the first time, then it's incremented by 1. So now after the first time, it's already storing a value of 2. And when it's run the next time, it's storing the value of 3, and so on and so on, if it makes sense. And after we did all this, we still don't have any logic for our fifth element. We already specified that we want it to be a background white, we want it to be a circle, we want it to be font color black and to have a border, but we do not do anything in our program to indicate when do we want to add a circle class. And we want to add the circle class we're going to do it using an if statement. An if statement. So, you could place it at the end, but to make it more logical, I think this is the best place to place it. And so let's say, if I say if 2 is bigger than 1, then I want the program to log true condition, right? So as long as 2 is bigger than 1, I want in the console to this text to appear. Let's save it. Let's refresh our page. Let's click on the create an element. So every time I click on the create an element, this whole piece of code is run, and if this statement is true, this should happen, right? If this wasn't true, then the curly braces wouldn't be entered at all. But as long as this is true, this piece of code will be executed. So every time I press create an element, the program reads 2 is bigger than 1, and it's still true. And every time it's gonna be true. So every time this code will be executed. And so true condition is printed onto our screen, like in the console, right? Got new number on here, so you can see that every time it has been executed. If I put, instead of this random condition, I put if my number, the number that we created already before, and it is less than 3, only then I want this true condition to be printed out to the screen. Let's check. Create an element. Number 1 is less than 3, so it's true condition, true condition. And when it hits 3, it's no longer true because 3 is not less than 3. So those curly braces are never entered. So this code is never executed. So only 2 times it's printed true condition. Now, what do we want to achieve in here? We want our every 5th element to look different. So how would we make this condition to be true? But only for this specific situation, for the 5th element. If our number equals 5, print 5th element. Save. Now, let's see if it works. Go pressing create an element 1. Nothing in the console. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, when the 5th element showed onto the screen, the console printed out 5th L as instructed. So we now already have like the true condition targeting a 5th element. And now, what do you think you should do to alter the class of the every 5th element? There is a thing called, if we wanted to interfere or like manipulate the visual layer, the appearance of something. So let's target the element. We want to target a div, and there is a special method called add class. Oh, sorry. There is a class. Or wait. Let's say there is I'm gonna add into the button, our button, I'm gonna add class, and I'm gonna call one red, I'm gonna call it active and disabled. Like, these are different classes, let's say. And now in our console, if I'm gonna like access the class list property, it's going to show me all the classes that I've given to our element. So that button now that I've given like 3 classes, red, active, and disabled, you can see them in here, and it has 3 classes, red, active, and disabled. So there is another thing that you could actually use, and it's called class list and then add. So I'm going to remove those because we don't need those classes. We want, for our 5th element, we want div class list, then add. And as an argument, I want to give it what I want to add. You don't need to put a dot because it's already a class list and it knows that whatever I'm going to put in here is a class. So I want to add a circle class. So let's see if it's actually going to work. Create an element, create an element, create an element, and happily our 5th element has got a different class now, so it's a circle. But our 10, 15, and the 20th element are still remaining as they were, because their condition only targeted div number 5. So in JS, there is a thing called modulo, and that thing, I'm going to give you examples of how it works. So for instance, if we wanted 5 modulo 4, it would give us 1. And why is it 1? Because 5, if we try dividing 5 by 4, the remaining amount would be 1. So if we did 5 modulo 2, then, or let's say 3 to make it different. So only the 1, 3 is 5 can contain 1, 3, and then remaining amount is 2. If we did 5 modulo 5, it contains the whole number inside and there is nothing left. So the remaining would be 0. If we did 10 modulo 5, again, it would contain 10, contain 2 fivers. There's nothing left. So again, it would be 0. And so modulo is very useful if we want to indicate, for instance, that we want to mark every 5th element. So to make it a little bit more clear using an example, is that our number, whatever number comes in here, so every time it's going to be a different number, so every box is going to be taken into consideration, and the condition is always going to take a different box. So if, for instance, the first number is going to be 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then we're going to do number modulo, and we are only interested that if whenever we divide number by 5, the remaining is going to be 0. So whatever we divide by 5, we want the remaining amount to be 0. Not 1, not 2, not 3. We want to divide by 5, like here. 5 divided by 5, nothing's left. 10 divided by 5, nothing's left. 15 divided by half, nothing's left. So only whole numbers. And so once we do that, all targeted from the very beginning, all the numbers we targeted from the beginning should be included. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So that's exactly what we wanted to achieve, and that's great. And we can also do it another way. So for instance, I'm just going to comment this out for now, and I'll show you a different way to do it, the same thing. And it's going to be it's our let number. So we're going to create another variable, also using a let, so it's going to be modified, and we'll give it a name of a active number, and also give it a value of 1. And then, and we have this active number. Instead of like using the modular, if you didn't know the modular existed, we would reset the value and start from 0. So every time this number would be incremented every time the function is run. An active number, once it hits 5, it's going to be reset to 0, and the counter will start over. So we have that active number now, and we put another condition. If active number equals 5, and then do exactly the same thing. So add a class, and also change its value to 1. And let's see how this works. Also, let's give it a console log so that we can observe at all times what is happening. It's very useful if you use a lot of console logs throughout your program, so that at any point, if you make a mistake and there is an error, you can actually like easily find out and then fix it, rather than if you put your code and etc. and keep writing on, and then you won't be able to even like find it easily. So we now have that. Create an element 1, create an element 2, create an element 3. Active number is okay. We need to increment active number the same way as we did with the number. So every time we incrementing, so adding 1 to number, we also activating. We are incrementing the active number, with the difference of like resetting it to 1 once it hits 5. So again, save it and refresh. Create a number, an element 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So far, so good. Okay, so something's wrong because we wanted every 5th element to be changing the class to circle, and 9 is not that number, is not every 5th element. So what went wrong? Okay, because it's resetting to 1. There's actually 1 short, so let's change it to 0, so that we reset it to 0, and then it should have the correct counter, that every 5th element is the element that we are targeting. Save it, refresh, create an element. Why? Right, save and refresh, create an element, create an element. So the console log is showing 1 and 2. The boxes are showing 1 and 2. So that is nice and tidy, exactly what we wanted. And you can see that once we hit 5, it actually resets to 0. And so the active number is now adding 1 to it. So it starts with 1. And the story begins from the beginning, from 0. So that active number goes on, number plus plus goes on, but the active number is reset to 0. And every time it is set to 5, then the class of a circle is added to it. And every 5th element now is a circle. So that's pretty much it. And the next thing is going to be your task to do.